Hello everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Casey, and I'm a growth advisor in residence at Greylock Partners, which is a VC firm in Silicon Valley. But I'm probably more interesting in that I used to run the growth team at Pinterest, and prior to that I started the marketing team at GrubHub. How many people in the audience have used Pinterest? Okay, pretty good. I feel pretty good about my job there. How about GrubHub? Yes, all right. They should have paid me more. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you guys about something you've probably heard a lot about, you've probably read a lot about, you've probably read a bunch of bullshit about, frankly. But I'm going to talk about growth teams. So I'm going to talk about what they are, why they're valuable, and how to start and scale them from my previous experiences. So what's the purpose of a growth team, this concept that you've probably heard about? And the purpose of a growth team is scale usage of a product that has product market fit, and to figure out a playbook on how to do that scaling. So if you're listening to that closely, you should probably say, how do I know if I have product market fit? And the short answer, you can slip. The short answer is you have people that are using your product and they would be pissed if it went away. Or another way to frame it is you have customers and your biggest challenge is how do you think about getting more customers, not like that the customers don't like it or things like that. But if you're like me, then you want a quantitative answer to that question. You don't want to just have like a touchy-feely version of answering that question. So the way that I try to answer this in a quantitative way, if you have product market fit, is to do a cohort analysis. How many people have done a cohort analysis before? Okay, a few of you, so I'll explain it to the rest of you. So this is an example graph of a cohort analysis. Essentially what you do is you take a group of people that tried your service in a particular time period, let's just say the month of January. And then if you have a product that has at all regular usage, which is what you're usually hoping for, you want to track over time. Let's say these are months, well, this is actually a DAU graph, so these are days. You track how many people that joined on day 0 continue to use your product into the future. And for a product that doesn't have product market fit, you will see this graph go to 0 over time. And for a product that has product market fit, you start to see this bend over time where it starts to flatten out. And these people 10 days later are likely people that have found value in your product, and that's why they continue to come back on, in this case, a daily basis, but it can be monthly, quarterly, whatever the right type of cadence makes sense for your product. So you at least have product market fit for a small segment of the 100 people that you acquire during this time period. Go forward. But that's not enough to say if you have product market fit. You then have to say, can I grow my business with the way my business currently retains users? So in that case, if I retain 10% of my users that I acquire, can I go get more and more users over time with that retention and grow the business profitably? And if you're like Pinterest when I joined, and there's no business model, you're not making any money, that means you need to be able to grow the volume of users over time without spending any money, using something like virality, which Pinterest used in the early days, or in the later days using SEO. And if you move forward, oh, my bad. Coordination. Yeah, there we go. And if you are making money, then you have to say, okay, that cohort that I drew represents an amount of money that I make per user, and can I make that money back on, can I spend money to grow the number of users that are coming to my service and make that money back within a period of time that I can reasonably estimate? So if I'm an early stage company, like I just created my company a year ago, I don't have a lot of data to build a really long cohort. I can't say, oh, 4 years into the future, here's what people are doing. So I usually have a few months of reliable data, which means that you want to have a payback period on your marketing spend that pays you back very quickly. So if I'm spending $10 to acquire a user, then I want to make at least $10 off of that user within, let's say, 3 months. And the more data you get about how your users behave and how you monetize them over time, the more you can stretch that payback period out because you're confident in the future revenues you're going to make over a long period of time. So at GrubHub, we basically aimed for a 6-month payback period because we had a few years of reliable data that people stayed with us for years. And then by the time we were about to go public, we actually switched to 1 year of data for our payback period because we had, at that point, lots of cohorts that predicted people use this thing for 4+ years. So if you're saying, I'm going to make my money back in 1 year, you're actually going to make a lot of profits in the long term because people use it for longer than 1 year. Okay. So, getting to the point of this, if you can't grow a product with the way your cohorts retain, then you don't have product market fit, and you need to find improvements to your product that retain better. So this is the type of analysis I do with companies to try to see if they're ready to grow. And if you haven't found product market fit, you should basically avoid the rest of my presentation until you do. But for the sake of today, I'm going to assume everyone in the room is at product market fit. But before I do, I'll give a little bit of case study of what happens when you think you have product market fit when you don't. Has anyone seen this graph before? Anyone follow Paul Graham on the Twitters? A few of you? Okay. So Paul Graham tweeted this graph about Homejoy, an on-demand cleaning service, a couple years ago. And he said that this was, as far as he knew, the fastest growing company that Y Combinator, his incubator, had ever funded. So people get excited about this, and you can move to the next slide. And Homejoy raised a lot of money. They raised $38 million to go into more cities. It started in San Francisco, to go into more services, and to go international. Now, what happened is 20 months later, Homejoy shut down after raising $38 million worth of venture capital. And here is what one of the articles around Homejoy said. A cleaning company charges north of $85 for a 2.5-hour cleaning, but to rope in as many new customers as possible, it offers a promotional price of $19. Guess what happens after the introductory deal is used up? No one comes back and tries it again, is basically what the question is asking. So, product market fit, it's not about revenue growth, it's not about user growth, it's not about getting to number one in the App Store. It's about profitable retention. Homejoy never had it, so even though they raised a bunch of money and had a lot of revenue, they still end up going where everyone goes if you don't have product market fit, which is into the dead pool. Okay, so we're going to assume everyone has product market fit here, and we're going to talk about growth teams, which are the teams you use to grow products once you have product market fit. So why a growth team? I thought product teams were in charge of making a product that people loved, and marketing teams were in charge of getting people to use that product. And the answer lies in how startups actually grow today. So there are 3 fundamental ways to grow a startup, and these of course can be layered on top of each other, but there's orders of magnitude importance here. So the first phase is what we call growth product or growth engineering. This is free growth in that you're not spending money on advertising. It's just engineering and design opportunity cost. It's scalable in that I'm making a tweak to the product, and if it works today, it's going to continue to work tomorrow and probably a year into the future. And it's very measurable in that I'm running an experiment and I'm seeing the difference in control versus enabled. And most of the big, fast-growing startups grow primarily through working on the product. Facebook didn't have a marketing budget for a very long time. Twitter didn't have a marketing budget for a very long time. They grew by continuing to iterate on the product and using the product to drive growth. The second phase is what I call performance marketing, growth marketing, whatever you want to call it. And this is fundamentally very similar to running experiments in the product. The only thing that's different is that you're using advertising budget to scale instead of engineering and design time. So this is spending money on AdWords, spending money on Facebook ads, retargeting. You can throw out an experiment. You can see if it drives users profitably. If it's working today, chances are it's going to work, in the future, at least somewhat. But these tend to hit efficient frontiers faster, and you get to a point with performance marketing where you can throw another $1 in, but you stop getting more than $1 back. And at that point, you should probably stop throwing more dollars in. So that's performance marketing. And then the third phase is what we typically think of when we talk about marketing, which is brand marketing. These are doing non-scalable, hard to measure processes, and they require a lot of money. So these are your TV ads, your events like this one, if we were trying to promote a specific brand. And these are things that are important to do, but usually they're things that make a lot more sense in a later stage of a startup. Yet it's what most people think about when they think about marketing. So move to the next slide. So why is startup growth different from marketing? Well, if the most important thing is working with the product to drive growth, marketing teams don't usually have the access or the expertise to work on the product. They might know that they need to work on SEO or need to improve the onboarding flow, and then they go ask the product team, hey, I want to go change the onboarding flow. And this product team is like, yeah, I'll put that at the bottom of my roadmap, meaning like I'm never going to work on it. Or in some scenarios, a CEO might actually give engineering resources to a marketing team, but they have trouble working with engineers to build the right thing because they don't have that skill set of working with engineers and designers to build things inside the product. So that's why growth is different from marketing. The other thing you should think about in the difference between like startup marketing and traditional marketing is thinking about the marketing funnel for a startup. So most of you are probably somewhat familiar with this type of funnel for marketing, where you've seen Glengarry Glen Ross, like AIDA. This is the way I think about it. You know, marketing, you create awareness, you try to rate interest, you try to rate commitment or preference, trial, and then use, and then hopefully loyalty at the end. This is a model of marketing that is based on making people want things. Startups don't usually say, hey, I'm going to make people want this. Startups usually focus on building things people already want. And if you do that, you can reverse the funnel. And you can say, hey, I've built something people want. Let me go focus on the people that already love the product. And let me go focus on people after that that are trying the product for the first time. Then let me go to people who have tried the product. And then let me go to people who I know need the product already because I built it for specific users. And then let me go find people that fit the core audience. And then at the very end, very late in your life cycle, you start doing overall awareness. So this is a complete reversal of the way marketing traditionally works. And it's something that demands growth product effort when you think about the type of tactics you would use to optimize this funnel versus traditional marketing funnel. So here's how I think about it, which is, you know, if you have people that are loving the product, what do you want to do? You want to make sure they continue to have a good time, and you want to make sure they tell their friends. Those are both product engineering efforts. If you have people that are trying the product, again, you want to make the product good, and then you want to make sure the conversion flow is very good or the onboarding flow is very good, which we call the new user experience, or NUX, at Pinterest. And then if you're moving on to people that are trying the product, that have tried the product, you want to get them back to it. You want to use emails, notifications, you want to use retargeting to get them back. And then if you're trying to find people that need the product, usually when people need something, they go to Google and they type in what they need. So you try to show up in organic and paid search. And then if you're expanding beyond that and you're like, well, I know who my core audience is, but they're not searching for it and they're not already on my product, then you use something like Facebook ads to go reach them. And then finally, once you've exhausted all of those resources, you start going into general awareness, which is where you get back into brand marketing. So we have a different funnel and a different skill set. That means growth is different from marketing. How about growth being different from product? So when you think about most product management, product development teams that you've worked for, that you've been at companies at, you probably notice that they focus on one thing singularly, which is creating value or improving on the value they've already created in a product. And that's not what growth needs to do. Growth needs to connect more people to the existing product, to value. So you're saying, if you're on a growth team, you're saying, I'm not gonna focus on making the product better today. I'm gonna focus on making sure people connect to the value that we've already built and have validated has product market fit. This is a very different way of working from traditional product management and engineering. You need to do a lot more experimentation, you need to have a lot more ideas, and you need to measure everything very quickly. A growth team that simply gets more experiments out can win without a lot more insight. Just because they're learning, if they're learning from every experiment, they're gonna quickly hone in on the things that matter for getting more people to understand the value that the product delivers and connecting more people to it. The other thing that's different between traditional product development and growth development is that you have to trade off between business value and user value, or short-term user value and long-term user value. And for a team that's been consistently focused on creating value, like a traditional product development team, this is a very hard change to make. So usually that necessitates a separate product and engineering team working on that. All right. So I've talked about, what growth is, when you need it, why it's different from product development, why it's different from traditional marketing, and I hope I've bought you in that this thing matters. So then if you're bought into the why this thing matters, and you're probably asking, okay, I understand the need for a growth team if I have product market fit. How do I start one? Who are these people? Where do they come from? Do we grow them out in the field somewhere and pluck them when they're ready? Like, how does this work? Typically the way growth teams start is you're building a business, you found product market fit, and you have one problem that you know could have drive growth for the company that just no one has focused on. It might be a terrible onboarding flow. It might be that your logged out experience sucks. Whatever the case may be, there's usually a bunch of these warts that just no one's looked into because they've been busy focusing on trying to build something that has value. So if you can get a prioritization of one of these problems and get a couple people to focus on it, then that's what basically how growth teams usually start. They're not even necessarily called growth teams at the time, but essentially what they're trying to find are high impact areas that require low effort and have a high chance of success. So an example is like, oh, there's no sign up button on this page that 1,000 people visit. If I add a sign up button, that's pretty easy and will probably get some people to convert. Like, those are the types of projects you're looking for in an early stage growth team. But you have to find out where those experiment opportunities are by analyzing your data, and then you just have to run experiments to learn. Some examples that I usually advise people to look at when starting a growth team that are kind of like easy areas to build credibility for growth are things like the logged out experience. Usually product teams are focused on building experiences for existing users, which means the logged out experience hasn't gotten a lot of love. Things like emails and notifications, they're outside the products. They tend to get less of a look from your product team. And referrals as well. One of the easiest things to do to grow is to get people who love the product to tell others about it, yet it's one of the last things that most people look at when they're building a product. It usually feels tacked on if it's there at all. So those are the great areas that I tell people to look for when they're thinking about building growth, because they're easy to iterate on. They have a high rate of learning in that you can run an experiment, you can learn really quickly if that experiment is having the impact you want. And it can have, and it's not a lot of effort, usually those areas. Some other areas where growth teams usually start, but they're a little bit harder, is getting more traffic, usually via SEO, because it takes time for Google to respond to your changes. And you want to kind of show results quickly to build credibility, or onboarding. Because, going back to that cohort, it might take a month or 3 months to understand if you're really getting better at improving the retention of the product, which is what onboarding should do. And then you don't want to kind of wait 3 months for your first experiment and be like, oh, turned out that failed. And then you go back to the drawing board, and then people are like, well, maybe joining this growth team was not such a good idea because I spent 3 months on one experiment and nothing happened. All right, we can go forward. Okay, so what does the team structure look like of an early stage growth team? Essentially, I'm up here, and I've been working on growth product management for the last few years, and I'm basically saying you don't need me. You need an engineer and a designer to partner up on a problem. And a nice to have is a PM or an analyst or data scientist to help them, but a lot of times the designer can play PM at this early stage and the engineer can play analyst, or vice versa in some cases. And the most important thing is that these people sit together and they work together on projects. It's not like a designer comes up with something brilliant, throws it over the wall to some engineer that he doesn't even know. This is a collaborative effort separated from the rest of product development. You don't want like the other designers to be like, why are you working on this stupid sign-up flow? You should be working on something cool. Like, you just want them to be laser focused on solving a problem together, separated from the rest of the company. And as you're thinking about, what problems you want to pick, one of the biggest problems I see with early stage growth teams is they don't pick a big enough part of the funnel to go attack. You want your experiments to reach the maximum number of users as possible. And if you're not reaching a large enough amount of people, it doesn't matter how big of an impact the experiment you have. It's not going to impact the business, which is what your goal is. So for example, when I came into the growth team at Pinterest, we had an engineer working on the referral flow, and he had an experiment that increased like refers like 1,000%. And I'm like, okay, well, what was the base rate? And he's like 10. And I'm like, okay, so you increased that 1,000%. What's the impact on the overall growth of new users for the business? None. Okay, why'd you run that experiment? That doesn't make any sense. You also want to find opportunities that have very clear outcomes. You're trying to avoid complicated trade-offs in your product. So you want to say, conversion rate went up 25%. Therefore, we got this many more people into the onboarding flow who activated. Therefore, we have more new users. You want like no controversy as to the outcome of the experiment, because most people are going to look at the experiments you're done. They're going to be kind of hacky. They're not going to be polished, and they're going to be trying to poke holes. You want the logic to be airtight on what you did and the impact it had. All right. Okay, so how do you get to that very specific example of what you're going to do if you're starting a growth team? So I'll show you the example that I did when I joined Pinterest. So I joined Pinterest, and I was supposed to be a product manager for SEO. But here's the scenario I saw when I started working with that team. We're already getting millions of visits a month from Google to board pages. I'm sure most people in this room would be dying for millions of visits a month from Google. But the conversion rate's terrible. It's less than 1%. So I talked to the conversion team, which was a separate team that I was not product managing at the time. And all of their previous conversion experiments had been on the homepage of Pinterest, which had dramatically less traffic than these board pages in aggregate. So I said, hey, you guys should prioritize working on conversion rate of these pages. And they were like, no. And I said, fuck you, I'm going to do it. So then on the SEO team, we start working on conversion rate. And we had no idea what to expect. We knew the conversion rate was terrible. But we said, hey, let's just set a random goal and see what we can do. We said, hey, let's set a goal of increasing this rate on board pages by 15%. Let's see what happens. And then you have to figure out what kind of experiment you can run to actually grow this conversion rate. So we had recently run an experiment on the SEO team where we made a new page available to Google that previously was not available. So we started getting traffic from Google to these pages. And what was weird to us at the time was our overall conversion rate, our overall signups went down during this period. So we analyzed the experiment and we figured out what happened, which is you could get to this, if you were logged out of the product, there was links to this page, but when you clicked on it, you got this modal here to sign up, because it wasn't available for Google, it wasn't available for logged out users. You had to sign in to see it. And funny enough, people actually signed up when you put this modal in front of them. So we said, okay, if people are actually signing up in this modal, we should try to find other places to leverage this. So we said, hey, why don't we throw this modal up when you click on any individual image from a board and you're not logged in? And then the other thing that we were doing is for Google, for users, we basically let you scroll infinitely to see as many images as were on the board. But to Google, we only let them see the first 25 pins, because otherwise they have to load JavaScript to load more, and we basically were trying to simplify the process for the Google bot. So we said, hey, if we're blocking Google at 25 pins, let's block the user at 25 pins, put a little modal at the bottom that says they need to sign up to see more. So we said, okay, let's launch this experiment, a couple variations. One is throw up a modal when they click on a pin. One is throw up a modal when they scroll past 25 pins, and one variant is to do both. Takes us 2 days to run this experiment, 50% improvement in conversion rate on the first go. So not only is a 50% improvement in conversion rate, had no impact on the volume of SEO traffic we were getting, and no impact on the activation rate of the people we signed up. So all these people were signing up, we're getting a good experience and sticking around. So when you have a project like this, on a large base of pages, and you have this kind of impact on conversion, which is far more than we were expecting, every graph in the company kinks up. And the CEO is like, what just happened? And then you tell him what you did, and then he says, how can I get more of that? And then your answer is, give me more engineers. And that's basically what happened. So before I talk about what we did after we got more engineers, I want to talk about some of the principles of what you're trying to do in this early growth team, which is what you're trying to do is do the minimum amount of work to validate an experiment idea and then get the experiment out there so you can get data. You're just trying to get data really quickly. So we spent 2 days on that. You guys took a look at the designs. They were pretty crappy designs, like you can be honest. And that's on purpose. We were just trying to validate that it was actually worth blocking users and that there would be impact. Once you verify that the experiment works, you can go back and polish it. You can make the design better. You can improve a lot of elements. And I'll show you what we did later. But you want to bias towards just running as many experiments as possible so you can learn fast and figure out what is the key thing about conversion that we can improve, or the key thing about referrals. You want to have a clear hypothesis for every experiment as to what you expect and how the impact of that experiment will grow the overall business. And the goal should be for every experiment, not that it wins necessarily, but that you learn from it. So, we didn't know if people had any interest in signing up for Pinterest coming from board pages. We just knew the conversion rate was very low. So our hypothesis was if we were more aggressive in doing it, people would show interest, and they did. But we didn't know that. And then in terms of process, I basically advise for very little process besides having a clear experiment document that explains what you're expecting to happen and why it's good for the business. So a simple Kanban form of product management is what we use during this time. You're basically deciding what the few key experiments are, for this week. You're regrouping on what you learned every week, and that's about all the process that I could handle at this point in time. Okay. Another principle of working with early growth team is about how to work with other teams. My answer is don't. Go find some far corner of the office, work on what you're doing in secret, launch those experiments, come back when you have your winning stuff. But you're going to get a lot of criticism early on for tackling product development in this different way, this very quick iteration, low fidelity way. It's not the way product development usually works. People hate it until they see the numbers. So you want to kind of go off and learn in secret and come back with your experiment data once you've really proven out the value. And again, as part of that, you want to carve off an area of the product that no one cares about. Like usually at this point in time, there was just no one who had worked on this page ever, right? So no one cared about it, therefore it was easy for me to go take it on. Even the conversion team that's in charge of conversion for the entire site had never thought about it. You don't want to be trying to build infrastructure in an early stage growth team. You just want to leverage whatever you can to get experiments out. And if you need to use third-party tools to do that, go ahead. Like if you need to use an Optimizely because you don't have your own experiment framework, great. If you need to use a third-party email tool, do whatever you got to do just to get experiments out there. All right. Okay. So we talked about starting a growth team. What an early experiment or set of experiments look like. Let's say you've done that and you're thinking about how can I grow the team. So how does a growth team evolve? And basically, what you see is once you find success in an area like this, in our case it was conversion, it's a lot easier to go get resources to work on other areas that might have problems. And we brainstormed a bunch at the beginning, things like onboarding, logged out experience, getting more traffic from SEO, getting more referrals. And you can build out sub-teams for each of these areas and start running experiments on all of them simultaneously. So this is basically what we got to at Pinterest, where we had, in our case, we didn't have a revenue team because on ad-supported businesses, you typically build an entire stack for revenue. So that was a separate team. But the rest of these teams were all sub-teams that we ended up building at Pinterest as part of the broader growth team. And at this point, you can't hide, right? You got over 10 engineers working on stuff, different parts of the funnel. People are going to know what you're doing. So it's important to set clear rules with the core product team as to what growth is going to own and what they're going to experiment on, and what the core product team is going to own and experiment on. So basically what we did at this time is we said, hey, growth is going to own the entire logged out experience. Growth is going to own our onboarding flow. Growth is going to own all emails and notifications. And growth is going to own our sharing flows. And if someone on core product team wants to do work in that area, they have to get permission from us. If you want to send an email about your new feature that you built, you need to come through us because we're the email experts, and we can make sure that you send it in a way that's going to be most impactful to business or prevent harm. Likewise, if we want to work in some other area of the product, we got to go get permission from you. If we're saying, hey, the repin flow, it takes too many steps and that's preventing us from hitting our key metric, we're going to have to go talk to the core product team about that and see if that makes sense for the work on it because that's their territory. All right, keep going. So how does the team structure change when you're building more of a legit growth team? So at this point in time, it's not like the super scrappy team, engineer, designer. You start having dedicated PM, analyst, multiple engineers, and a designer for each of those areas we talked about in the last slide. So, dedicated designer, engineer, PM, analyst, and probably a couple other engineers just on conversion optimization or just on onboarding. Now, the way that there's different ways to run a growth team organizationally, but the way that I found works best and that scales best is to have a cross-functional team. What that means is that designer, engineer, analyst, PM are working together and sitting together, but they all report to their functional heads. It's not like all these people report to some VP of growth. And the reason that that's good is because when they go back to their broader product management team or their broader design team, they're helping those teams learn how growth operates. Whereas if there's an entirely separate growth team, they have no incentive to kind of share information with the core product team, and sometimes those learnings work across teams, or to build empathy for what growth is doing and deeper understanding. Again, the sub-teams sit with each other, right? So you got engineers next to designer, next to analysts working on the same problem. And they sit close to other sub-teams, and they regroup regularly as a broader growth team because a lot of things that you learn can be shared across different parts of the funnel and be successful. So what we did is we did a weekly growth sync where we went over successful experiments so that the entire growth team could learn from those and maybe apply them to their different area. But yeah, the actual sub-teams, they meet a lot more frequently, so they have daily stand-ups, things like that, and they're very tight, honed in on each other.
In a smaller company, where is it ideal to have the head of the team report to?
Yeah. So in a small company, like if you're starting a growth team, there really shouldn't be a head of a team. There should just be like an engineer and a designer working together. And in the case of this at Pinterest, where you have PM, designer, analyst, engineers, there's actually really 4 leaders of the team. You can arbitrarily say that one of them is the most senior and therefore speaks for the entire growth team, but the goal is to basically have 4 peers in the different areas that are working together on strategy, where to go, and they should all be basically senior leaders at the company. So you might not have, on a smaller company, dedicated analysts, so you might not have you might not have as broad a cross-functional team, but you should basically have a director of engineering report up to head of engineering, a director of growth product reporting up to your head of product, or whatever the case may be. And you might not have a couple of those roles, or you might be sharing a designer with core product, but it basically scales down based on the number of people you have. What I see a lot, which I don't recommend, is you're an early stage company, you're 20 people, and you hire like a VP of growth, and then they don't have any engineering resources. They're just expected to, beg, borrow, steal from core product or run some marketing experiments. That doesn't really work. It's the cross-functional team that works, and leadership is less important if you just have a group of people working together on a problem set. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Then who provides thought leadership?
So the question is, who will provide thought leadership in that regard? And the answer is everyone should. So, I'll get to this a little bit later, but anyone that joined the growth team at Pinterest was expected to come up with an idea per week on how to grow the product. And our expectation was that, those ideas are going to suck for a while. But, idea generation is a skill that you build by practice. And what you see is, once they're 6 months into the growth team, all of a sudden their ideas start getting better. And essentially, we tried to raise all of those voices. So we'd have, a 24-year-old engineer go up in front of the entire company on Friday Lunch and Learn and talk about what he learned from running his experiments, the impact it had, and the broader application to the rest of the company. So we wouldn't funnel it all into me as the head of growth product or the head of growth engineering. Basically, we tried to build as many people that could talk seriously about growth as possible, because there's so many conversations that are going to happen with different people. You want everyone to be super educated. All right, so principles of an adolescent growth team. You're a little bit more built out. You have a full team. Here, you can't just be going off in a corner and running experiments. You have company level visibility, so you have to invest in strategy to define where in the funnel you want to grow and how you're going to do that. So at this point in time, the CEO asked me as the product leader, what's your product strategy? And what I instead delivered was an operational strategy, saying here's how growth is going to work, here's why it needs to work that way, and here are like the experiments after getting someone bought into the operational strategy that we might think about doing. So really thinking about how I can get people, obviously the executives at the company, but across the company to understand how growth works, why it's different, and why it's needed for the company is super important. As we mentioned before, you want to divide teams into areas that will have the most impact. If there's no opportunity for referrals in your business, don't create a referrals team just because it's a part of the standard, growth funnel. Like, focus on the few areas that you really have need. You might at this point in time only have like 2 areas, like an acquisition team and a retention team. That's the way I ran it at GrubHub. We talked about having clear strategies even at the sub-team level, and when you're building roadmaps for growth, and it's such an experiment-based format, you basically want to have high-level themes on what you want to work on based on the data. So the data says, oh, our conversion into getting people to download the app is really low. That will be an area we work on for the next quarter. We're not exactly sure every experiment we're going to run, because from every experiment we're going to learn something new that drives the next experiment, but we're going to commit to running a certain amount of experiments. That's the type of roadmap you have on a growth team. And you need to be able to share that up and across. So core product teams see what you're doing and why. Executives see what you're doing and why. Otherwise, what we found is that they start to build pretty negative assumptions for why you do that stuff. So like, I've literally had people from the company go on Twitter and complain about a growth experiment because they assumed some nefarious incentive for me running the experiment. And later I go talk to that engineer and say like, you know why we did that is because like, we walled off the mobile website because like we saw the data, and everyone that goes in the mobile website like hates us because the mobile website's really slow. If you build a better mobile website, we'll be happy to remove the wall that was preventing people from getting there. And they're like, oh, I completely understand. I'm sorry for going on Twitter and bashing you. But if you don't do that, people will assume the worst. So you have to really over communicate when you're doing different type of development like you are in growth. When you're building a growth team and you're beyond like, hey, we're in the basement, no one realizes what we're doing, you have to invest in clear communication as to what you're doing and why, which we talked about. But you also have to start owning your own infrastructure. So you can't just say like, oh, I'm going to build on top of this hacky thing or use all these third-party tools. If you're going to say that you're owning emails and notifications, that means you need to own all the infrastructure around it. That means you need to own the pipelines of how data gets in there. That means you need to own the tool that other teams might use. Like, ownership is ownership, and that means the infrastructure around it. Yeah, investing in very clear lines between growth and core product, which we mentioned. And at this point in time, you might want to consider, if you're doing performance marketing, adding marketers to that cross-functional team, because they might have good acquisition ideas, or they might need support from engineering that you won't hear about if they're not part of your cross-functional group. Okay, the other thing that you need to think about in very strategic way when you're operating a growth team at this size is setting goals correctly, which is something I had to do a lot of experimentation in. So first thing is you need to build up an understanding of all the key metrics that you're trying to influence. So in the case of Pinterest at the time, we're trying to increase the amount of traffic we get, the amount of signups we get off of that traffic, the amount of successfully onboarded users from those signups, and the amount of people that we long-term retain. You need to build up an understanding of like, what would happen if we just all left? Like, what would the organic growth rate of those metrics be, or the organic decline? And then you have to build up an understanding of what type of impact with our experiments we think we can have on those. And those should be absolute goals that you set. And the growth team needs to own that, not a finance team, not some other team. You're the expert in the way the metrics work and the impact you can have on them, and you need to own the forecasting of that, which was painful for a while, but we figured out how to get good at it eventually. And then you'll probably say, well, why do setting absolute goals matter so much? And the only reason I can answer that question is because I've done everything else and have to live with the repercussions. So first thing is, why not set a percent goal? And related to that experiment with virality when I joined Pinterest, a percent goal hides the overall impact. So if you're saying I increased something 1,000% and only one person was doing it before, that might not be a big enough impact for the company, even though it sounds impressive. The other issue we had setting goals was people would want to set rate goals. So I'm going to increase activation rate to 25%. And then what happens is if a team above the activation team gets really good at sending more traffic or sending more signups, the activation team actually gets upset because it hurts their metric, right? It might be easier to move the denominator than move the numerator in a rate, in which case one team looks good and the other team looks bad. That's not great. You want everyone aligned on the same goal. The other mistake we made is trying to set our goals entirely off of experiments. So we say, hey, we're going to run a bunch of experiments. We're going to add up the impact on all of those experiments. And that's going to be, we're going to set a goal of an experiment-based impact number. And this biases you against investing in infrastructure that might not easily be experimented on. So you would, in this case, never invest in a new system to create landing pages, in which case you're launching landing pages from nothing, so there's no A/B test you can do. And that was one of the biggest impactful projects that we did at Pinterest. Right, next slide. Okay, so I've talked a lot about kind of boring process stuff, how you work. Let's talk about kind of some actual examples of moving forward. So in that earlier experiment I showed, which we called gift wrap, you basically had kind of a modal when people clicked on things and a modal when people scrolled to the bottom. So once we found that winning idea, the tendency of a lot of teams is to say, okay, let's go find some totally different part of the funnel and recreate that same level of impact. The right thing to do is say, okay, we found something that works, let's double down. So in this case, once gift wrap was successful, we did dozens more experiments trying to improve the impact that experiment had, testing the copy, testing the design, and continued to improve that conversion rate on top of the 50%. I think it now converts 150% better than it used to. And we were also not able to just increase the conversion rate, but increase the user experience of the page. So this is an example now of what the modal looks like, and it's a third of the size of what it was, and it converts even better than the original version. So we're able to increase the conversion rate and decrease the kind of user frustration by having this thing block everything we're doing. And that's important. Next slide. And then we're able to simplify the form when you click on a pin as well. We tried a bunch of other variations, which I could show you later if you're interested in, but this simple thing worked best. Other type of project that we talked about is investing in infrastructure, and I'll give you an example of that. So we built up an email and push notifications team under growth for Pinterest, and our email system was kind of growing, it was growing cumbersome. We had all of this legacy email that we sent when we were a more social-based service, in that you followed your friends and you got emails when they repinned something or when they followed your board, etc. We're sending millions of these. But the growth team, when it started creating its own emails and notifications, found that emails that were personalized content were performing a lot better than these social emails. Yet we had no control over when these social emails were sending, because they just auto-triggered after repins happened or board follows happened. So you could have been getting a personalized recommendation email right after getting an email about someone following your board. So we said, okay, this sounds bad. We have no control over this. We should probably fix this. The next slide. So we basically said we're going to rebuild our email infrastructure from scratch. And it's going to take 9 months, but things are going to work a lot better once it happens. So what we did is we said, let's, for every user in the Pinterest system, which I think was like over 100 million users at the time, let's log the open rate and click-through rate of every type of email we've sent them. So we can say, hey, Casey prefers people following his board emails because he opens them at 30%, and more pins for his new board, he only opens at 15%. Therefore, we should probably try to send him more board follow emails, or vice versa. We also started logging when each pinner liked to receive each email based on the historical times that they open the email. So if you're always opening emails at 10 a.m. every day, we probably should be sending you emails around 10 a.m. And if other people are opening them at 7 p.m. on Sunday, maybe we should only send one email a week on 7 p.m. on Sunday. So we ranked each template based on the likelihood someone would enjoy a template, and then we build slots when we are allowed to send an email to each specific user in our database. So then when the slot comes up, 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, whatever the case may be, we send the highest ranked template that we have content for that user. Oh, click-through rate. Yeah, which is, of the people that see the email, how many click through back to Pinterest. Yep. So we spent 9 months doing this, and this had a massive impact on the impact of emails and notifications in terms of driving people back to Pinterest. But it wasn't an experiment. It was infrastructure we had to own, and it was the longest growth project we had ever done to date. But we knew that this was infrastructure that we needed to level up, or else we were going to hit a cap on our growth. Next slide. Okay. So I gave an example of kind of scaling a growth team, what I called the adolescent growth team. What's an example of kind of like super serious growth team, rated M for mature growth team? And there's only a few of these in the Valley. I'd say Pinterest is moving in this direction. Facebook, LinkedIn are examples of this. So the difference between the growth team that I just described and a mature growth team is that mature growth teams have built up enough respect in an organization where they don't need separate real estate to define themselves. Instead, they're more mission-based. So growth teams attack problems that prevent people from experiencing the current value of a product. Whereas core product teams build new value or iterate on existing value. So once you've built up good respect between the rest of the company and growth team, and they understand that you're there to reduce friction that prevents people from connecting to the value that they've worked hard to build, or that you're bringing more people to experience the value they've already built, it becomes a lot easier to go anywhere in the product you need to go to do that. So, that example earlier of like, hey, the repin flow at Pinterest takes too many steps. I can improve the conversion rate of people who attempt to repin and actually repin. At this point in time, a growth team can go tackle that because the team that's working on repins is usually working on making repins better or more valuable instead of reducing the friction of getting people to repin. Yep. So what are some examples in my career of kind of this new type of approach to growth? So I can give kind of GrubHub examples and Pinterest examples. Sorry for the fantastic visuals on this slide. One example with GrubHub, for those of you who haven't used GrubHub, it's a place where you can see all the restaurants that deliver to your address and order food online. And what we noticed is that the more restaurants we were able to add to someone's search results, the more likely that they would order food, and the more likely that they would come back and order food again in the future. So we basically were able to map what the conversion rates look like based on the amount of results that we would show you. And in every city, there was some sort of S-curve, where if you had, less than 10, 15 restaurants, conversion rate was really low. Once you hit a threshold that was greater than the expected number of restaurants people thought existed that delivered to them, conversion rate shot up. So every graph kind of looks like that. And then of course conversion rate would continue to go up almost infinitely, but you'd see like this big spike and then it would kind of taper off. So once we did that, we were able to see for every search, where were we not getting enough results to kind of maximize our conversion rate, and then go prioritize our sales team to build more restaurants there. Another example of like finding these bottlenecks that prevent you from being successful, when we talk to people about why they didn't order food more often on GrubHub, they would say, oh, it's too expensive. And we're like, what are you talking about? GrubHub's free. And then they'd be like, no, like if I want to order food for myself, like I need to order at least $20 to hit the minimum, like, and then I got to decide if like that's going to be good like the next day because I need to order too much food than I need. So we're like, okay, so the market, the restaurants that we signed up, they were creating their own minimums and fees. And in a place like New York, so competitive, pretty much no one had a minimum and no one had a delivery fee. But in Chicago, pretty much every restaurant had a delivery fee and minimums that were like 10, 15 bucks, sometimes even 20 bucks or higher. So what we did is we went back to restaurants and we got a few people to attempt lowering their minimum to see what would happen. And then what basically happened is they got way more volume to make up for the fact that each order was a little bit less profitable for them in a way that made them more money. And then we built a testimonial that we could go sell to other restaurants so we could gradually lower minimums over time. One more. The last example is, we're measuring at GrubHub how many people order again within 30 days of their first order. That's kind of the activation metric for GrubHub. And each year that kept going up. And I think in 2011, it started dipping down below 2010. And we're like, what's going on here? So we dig into the data, and we basically see when you create your first order, you can either create an account, log in with Facebook, or continue as a guest. And what we saw is the number of people continuing as a guest, which we added for conversion reasons, had crept up to 50% of first-time users, and their activation rate, meaning the number of them who became a second-time user, was decreasing over time. So a higher volume of these users that are decreasing their repeat purchase over time meant that it was dragging down overall repeat purchase rate. So we basically, once we were able to identify this, we redesigned the page that emphasized the value of creating an account. And basically, it used to have like, email, Facebook, guest as like 3 options right next to each other. So we basically, in between guest and creating an account, we put a list of reasons why you want to create an account, like easy to reorder food, save favorites, all of that kind of stuff. And then at the bottom it says like, no thanks, I hate convenience, continue as a guest. Basically, we were able to drop the number of first-time users that were guests from 50% to 15%. And the people that were creating accounts were retaining at the way people who were creating accounts last month. So all in the framing and pushing people to, hey, this is a service that you're going to use regularly instead of a thing I'm just going to skip through and never think about again, made a big impact for the business. All right, keep going. Yeah, okay. So Pinterest examples of finding these ways to kind of reduce friction. The Pinterest product, when we did user research, it was basically throwing too many concepts at you when you join. So people were getting just lost. They weren't connecting to the value of Pinterest, which is being able to find things that you're interested in and then go take action on them. So what we did on the growth team is we made a list of the core actions people really needed to learn about Pinterest to connect to the value, and then we just deleted everything else from the product for the first 30 days. So in this example, if you've used Pinterest, you're used to seeing an image and then a description of the image that's added by the user, and then a Casey pinned this to this board attribution. We basically just deleted all of that from the product and said, hey, what you're here to do is tap on pins, and then when you get to a pin, it'll basically say, hey, did you know you can save this? Everything else is deleted from the product until we know that you can scroll and see a lot of images, and that you can save them, and that you can click on them to get more information by going to the website. This, over time, doubled the activation rate of Pinterest because people were able to see more things, which means they were more likely to find something they liked, and they were less likely to get distracted by all these parts of the product that it didn't make sense to learn about yet. All right, so team structure for a grown-up growth team. As you imagine, it gets a little bit more complicated. You start adding researchers, qualitative researchers to the team, marketers to the team, operations, so people that are close to the customer that can bring in customer service issues. And they all become part of this cross-functional growth team along with the PM designers, engineers that have been working at it for a while. And you can form new sub-teams around business problems. So, the example of like, repin conversion is going down as part of the core product. Maybe it's worth spinning a sub-team out just for that focuses on that in the growth team. Teams can grow very big at this point in time. So, Pinterest growth team, I think, is 70 people now. Uber's is over 500 people. I think Facebook's is around 500 people. Like, these teams can get big because if they continue to show value to the business, it's very easy to justify adding additional people to them. But when they grow that big, it's not like you can all meet in a small room and talk about your experiments every week. So you have less regular meetings with the entire growth team, maybe a quarterly summit, that sort of thing, and then you invest a lot more in asynchronous communication, Slack, notes to the team, that sort of thing. Okay, I'm going to end with some of the principles of mature growth teams, and I'm going to go in depth on a couple of these that we haven't talked about as much. So iterating, which we've talked about, challenging assumptions, prioritizing ruthlessly. We talked about idea generation as a skill that needs to be practiced, how nimble growth teams are on process. Learning from experiments is all that matter. It's not necessarily about winning, it's about learning. Metrics and user experience matter at this stage. So literally one of the goals of the Facebook growth team is increasing their net promoter score, which is why you see all these weird things when you log on to Facebook now being like, hope you're having a great day, Casey. It's because their net promoter score is terrible and they're trying to improve it. Those are all experiments run by their growth team. making sure you have the right metric. So active users is what matters, not signups, not total registered users. Know if you're optimizing or diverging, which I'll talk more about, and then understanding your growth model. So keep going. So about the iterative approach, basically the way we think about it on growth teams is that we're running giant psychology experiments on users every day. In the case of Pinterest, it's millions of people. You can use experiments to learn what people do, and you can use research to understand why they do it. And what you want to do is iterate quickly so you can learn the most about what people do before you sink months of effort into something that's not going to work. We had a lot of early things on the growth team where like a designer would spend 3 months on something, we throw it out there, it's beautiful, but there's a fundamental flawed assumption and all of that work is gone. You want to validate your assumption before a designer puts that amount of effort or an engineer puts that amount of effort in. Okay, we talked a little bit about this, generating good ideas. We think every person on the team should generate at least one idea a week. We review them in a weekly meeting, and if the idea is good enough, we add it to the queue, and if it's bad, we give the person feedback so they get better. After a while of doing this, even if you're completely clueless about growth when you start, you're going to get better every week, and eventually you're going to have ideas that other people haven't thought of, and we saw this time and time again. Go on. Okay, prioritization process. So you're like, okay, I get you got these huge teams. How do you actually decide what to work on? Basically what happens is the leads of the team prioritize each half on high-level themes that they want to focus on. And then with a broader sub-team, so the conversion team, for example, everyone brainstorms ideas that they think can have an impact on those teams. Oh, we want to improve the mobile web to app handoff. What are a bunch of ideas on ways we can do that? As an example. Then the leads will gather all of those ideas and prioritize based off of effort, impact, and chance of success. Obviously you want things that are low effort, high impact, and high chance of success. But you run out of those eventually, and then you have to start taking harder bets. What happens at Pinterest is then those leads will present in an OKR format. Are people familiar with OKR? No? Okay. OKR, we got one over here. Baller. OKR is a Google terminology. It means objective and key results. So it says, here's what I'm going to do, and here's what I expect in a metrics-based way to happen from that. So I'm going to work on improving the mobile web to app trade-off, and then I'm going to increase the number of people who land on mobile web that become mobile app users by 5%, which translates into this amount of mobile app users. So basically what happens, you present that, and if you've done a good job on it, CEO approves, and if you haven't, he's going to give you a lot of feedback on what you need to do to improve it. But then that's just a rough roadmap. As I mentioned earlier, learning from experiments allows you to reprioritize based off of your learnings throughout the quarter or the half. But what does happen to the OKR process, if you're able to present a lot of things that you want to do and the things that you're not doing based on the resources you have, and you have a lot better roadmap than another team, then it gives the execs an opportunity to say, I should be prioritizing new hires to go over to this team versus this other team. All right, keep going. Okay, so if you actually get your prioritization done, you get that approved, how do you actually work on an individual project? So basically, we'll do a project kickoff at Pinterest, and we'll start by talking about the problem we're trying to solve. Usually the PM does this, how we think we might solve it, any metrics we need to understand if we're solving it, and then we send the notes of all of that to the entire team, so everyone can be visible on what we're doing and why. Well then, Pinterest, big users of Slack, so then a Slack channel is created specifically for that project. And the most important thing about this meeting is that the designer, engineer, and PM that are going to work on that project have to be in that meeting and allocated to the project at the very start. Otherwise, they're not going to take ownership over the project. And that's what you really want, is you want kind of design, engineering, and product ownership on what they're doing so they understand why they're doing it and they come up with the best solution. Keep going. Then what happens is the engineer and designer, and usually the PM on the project, will be in charge of coming back with potential solutions to the problem we talked about in the kickoff. And usually this is like a couple days. So they're partnered together, which means that it's not like the designer saying, oh, this engineer doesn't want to work on cool stuff, or the engineer is saying what the designer is recommending isn't feasible. Like they're a partnership together to come up with what are the ideas that are likely to work that are feasible. When they're ready, they do a review with the leaders of that team, so the tech lead for conversion in that case, or the PM lead, or the design lead. And what will typically happen when you're coming up with ideas to solve a problem is you'll have new analytics needs. So you're like, oh, I put a login button here, I need to make sure that gets tracked. So in this ad hoc meeting, we'll talk about those changes. And then usually with that group of like the leads of a team plus the designer, engineer, and PM working on it, you'll hone to a couple concepts that you're ready to actually try to launch an experiment for, and then you'll go try to implement that experiment. At this point, an experiment doc is created that describes exactly what you're going to do, including screenshots of, if it requires front-end design, the design changes that are going to be made, exactly what you expect to happen, exactly what needs to happen for you to feel comfortable shipping it. And then in the case of Pinterest, because Pinterest has a lot of data, you actually launch that experiment to 1% of users, just to make sure that you're not going to like break the entire site when you launch your experiment, which has happened multiple times. And you have both the designer, PM, and engineer that worked on that vision to QA the thing and say, hey, this thing is ready to go live. The experiment doc looks correct. And then the process actually gets launched. We also do something at Pinterest where any code that's pushed by an engineer has to get reviewed by another engineer and say, hey, this code's actually valid and ready to go live. So that's what I mean by an E+ from a peer engineer. It's basically saying, yeah, this experiment makes sense to me and should be launched. All right, and keep going. Yeah, oh, for those of you who don't use Slack, Slack is a chat platform for teams. So basically you can create a myriad numbers of teams at the, whatever group level. So you can say, me, you, and you are a team, and just create one, or you can say like, hey, this entire audience here is a Slack group, and then you kind of define who's in that communication, and then you chat back and forth. Refresh has a Slack channel. How do they get access? Read your email newsletter. Okay. So what's more important than a project kickoff or actually launching an experiment is doing an experiment review. And during that experiment review, you want to go back and say, what is the question we wanted to answer? Did we gather the data to know if we've answered the question? If not, how do we get that data? If we got the data, what does the data say? And then make a decision on next steps. Then you want to socialize the learning from that experiment, win or lose. And if it's a good thing, you want to send like a win email to the entire group or the entire company, depending on the merit. Update notes, communicate learnings and stand up. And then what will happen, since we have a thing where we try to iterate quickly and put unpolished designs out there to a small percentage of users, we'll bring the design to the design leader for the growth team and say, hey, do we need to polish this design before it can ship to 100% of users? Like, are there certain design standards we didn't meet to kind of get things out the door? And sometimes there's small tweaks that need to be made before we'll actually ship the design. Yep. Yeah. So the question is about how many overlapping projects you might have at one point in time. And the way we've kind of designed things at Pinterest is that you have subteams that own different parts of the product. So different subteams don't really overlap ever because there's clear ownership of who owns each part of the product. And then if you have 4 engineers on one team, let's say like the conversion team, then usually the way that's structured is like there's an Android lane, an iOS lane, a web lane, that kind of thing. So basically the PM is in charge of making sure there isn't any overlapping experiments. There can definitely be an example of deeper down in the funnel, there's another experiment that hits that same user, but in that case you expect the same amount of people in control and enabled of that experiment to see the variation, so it should kind of even out. Okay, so what did we not talk about? We talked, yeah, next slide. Okay, I mentioned earlier in the principle of mature growth team about optimizing versus diverging. So when you're running an experiment, or when you're thinking about running an experiment, what you'll get a lot of times is like, do we even need to experiment with this? The answer is like 100% yes. You always need to experiment. You'd be surprised the types of things that have unintended consequences. And every time we've decided not to do something, we've kind of rued that decision in retrospect. But what needs to be tested can be different for each experiment. So the point is to define whether your experiment is an optimization experiment or a divergent experiment. And if it's an optimization experiment, that means you're iterating on a theme that you already know, which means you want to isolate one variable and understand exactly how that variable makes an impact on the key metric you're trying to grow. But if you're a divergent experiment where you're completely changing something to something new, don't try to like isolate all of the variables to get your way there. Just try the new thing. And if the new thing works, you can go back and piece out what individual parts of it helped it work better. But you get to the new state that works better a lot faster.
Hi, Casey. Thank you for your time tonight.
Yep.
What would be your best guidance to not have data deficits as far as the metrics that you should be tracking or not?
Yeah, so the question's about data deficits of like, you have things you want to learn about, but you don't actually have the right thing tracked. And I think it's important to answer, is it something you can track and you just haven't done the appropriate work, or is it something that isn't really possible to track? Like, if a key part of understanding if people are having success is something that happens offline, then that might be harder for you to track. But if it's a button, then it's easier to solve. So in the case of Pinterest's mission is to help people discover things that they're interested in and then go do those things in real life. We can't tell if people go do those things in real life. So the key action that Pinterest uses is the save. So if they actually save something, that indicates that they have intent on taking action on it, and that's the closest part we can get to the thing that we really care about for fulfilling our mission. And Pinterest recently launched something called a tried it button, which is like if you actually did something, you can kind of say, I tried it and here's the review. And if everyone starts doing that, that might move to be the key metric of the business. So that's one example. I'm going to assume for the rest of the answer that you actually can track the business. A lot of this usually happens via trial and error. So you basically, you run an experiment or you're looking at a funnel and you're like, oh, I'd really love to separate this by like logged in versus logged out users. And you're like, crap, I don't track that. And then the answer becomes like, how can I track that? Is there an easy way to do it? Fortunately, analytics tools have gotten a lot better at this over time. So Mixpanel, if you're using that, you can basically track any property of a user or non-user. Heap tracks basically every piece of your JavaScript automatically without you having to tag that stuff in the beginning. So I'd recommend starting with those tools and then trying to think about strategically how you fill in the gap based on the questions you come up with. You're always going to have scenarios where you're like, oh man, I don't have the thing I want now. But then the next question should be, how do I go add that really quickly so that the next time we have that question, it isn't an issue. What we ended up doing at Pinterest is we would diagnose one engineer per week as the person in charge of metrics. So if anything in our metrics went up or down unexpectedly, that engineer was in charge of figuring out why. And then basically, if they were in charge of figuring out why and they didn't have the right thing tracked, they would go fix it. Because now it's like their issue instead of like someone else's issue that you're not being tracked. And over time, we went from that being a weakness of the company to being a strength. I think you can definitely be one of those people that thinks very ahead about everything that might be important and track it. But that can also be dangerous because you learn more about what's really important by running experiments. And if you're going to take if you're an early stage startup and you're like, okay guys, got the perfect analytics set up, it's only going to take 9 months to implement, you're going to run out of money by the time you've ever run an experiment, right? So you don't want to get in trouble of doing that. So yeah, kind of learning over time, filling in gaps, putting engineers in charge of analyzing data, and those are the people that can go fix metric discrepancies, all help. Yep.
Since growth involves so many experiments and so much product tweaking, would you say that the PM should be also a software engineer, or what other backgrounds have you seen work for PMs?
Yeah, so the question is, in growth, does a PM need to have a software engineering background? And the answer is I don't, so the answer is no. But no, I don't think you need to have a software engineering background, but you need to be able to talk with engineers and designers effectively, which means you need to be technical enough, and you can learn that over time. but you need to have the willingness to learn. I do think being able to write your own SQL queries so that you can be data independent is a requirement. But I wouldn't go beyond that and say that, hey, you need to know how to write Python or JavaScript or Ruby, whatever the team works on. But you need to be able to understand at a technical architecture level what's going on and is there a way to improve parts of that. The beauty of having a cross-functional team is that usually PMs, engineers, designers have different strengths and weaknesses. So a lot of times, a lot of the great ideas from engineers come in the form of improving the technical architecture or the speed, things like that a PM's not going to have as much visibility into. I'd say at Pinterest, only a few of PMs across the company had a engineering background. When I joined it, we had two PMs with an engineering background on growth, and then I was one of two who did not. And then later on, I don't think I hired anyone on the team that actually had an engineering background. I'm not against it or anything, it just wasn't a requirement. We more so thought about how well they could talk to engineers, design experiments, understand problem sets. And I think at the company level, maybe a third of the PMs had previous engineering experience, and the rest came from everywhere. I came from marketing. We had people come from legal, sales backgrounds, operations, kind of all over the place. PM doesn't have a traditional career path, so we're generally the misfits of the organization. The island of lost toys, folks. Yeah.
So we're kind of smaller. We're not really mature. We're maybe adolescent, somewhere between adolescent and stage 4. And I think, we want to drive user acquisition, but there's a gap between sign up and purchase, and that feels like it slows things down. And so I wonder, do you think we should first get better at understanding the user all the way to purchase, or just start dumping people into the sign up and kind of looking at that as our kind of efficiency metric? Yeah,
so it depends on how well they eventually convert into purchase today. And if you believe if you're dumping more people into that flow, if you expect them to act reasonably the same as it happens today. So what can happen is, okay, my long-term eventual organic conversion rate is 20% or something. Let me go buy a bunch of Facebook ads, and everything should convert the same. And then typically what I see is performance marketing converts into a lifetime value of at least 15% less than organic users. But sometimes, if you're not buying the right people, none of those people end up converting, and then you've wasted a lot of money. So if the best thing for you to be able to do is, if there's a long period of time between sign up and actual purchase, are there any micro conversions along the way that indicate the person's along a path? Like opening an email newsletter, reading a blog post, etc. And then you can kind of break up that long period of time into these separate chunks. And then you can get kind of these leading indicators that see if you're going to go allocate resources to Facebook ads or AdWords, do those people seem like they're moving along the path at the same rate of the past data? And if you can't do that, it's never a bad idea to focus on the bottom up of the funnel, like I mentioned in this post earlier. So starting with improving the actual purchase, and then when you feel like you've gotten good at that, moving up into how many people sign up or how much traffic you're getting. So going bottoms up is never a bad idea, but if you can find micro conversions in between, that can help you make that decision faster to scale up acquisition or not.
What resources like books, blogs, sites do you think are good? I remember when you first started, you said a lot of disinformation about growth hacking, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then how would this model or this perspective change if it's B2B, like if it's a big ticket item where it's thousands of dollars instead of just clicks or something like that?
Yeah. So in terms of resources, my blog's pretty amazing. No, I'm just kidding. It's all right. I'd say the best resources by far are the blogs of Brian Balfour and Andrew Chen. And then I'm probably a very, very distant third. I'm trying to think of it. The problem in the growth community in terms of bloggers is that a lot of people haven't really been consistent over time. They might write 3 or 4 good blogs, then they go get a job where they're working a serious amount of hours, and then they don't blog again for 3 years. But Andrew and Brian have done a good job of getting a lot of great information out there. And now they've actually partnered up on a company that helps teach aspiring PMs, marketers, et cetera, how to do growth, called Reforge. So the Reforge blog has some good content too, if you're not willing to drop a few grand on a course. And then the second question was, hey, how does this change in a B2B context? Obviously, GrubHub and Pinterest are both B2C examples. So your teams are going to be slightly different in terms of what they work on, but we're seeing a convergence in basically how consumer startups work and how B2B startups work, where B2B is starting to look a lot more like consumer. So instead of having a purchase funnel, like the last question, you might have a lead funnel, and it might take a lot longer to close, but again, you have these steps along the way that indicate a person's along the path to closing. You're most likely going to have at some part of that funnel, it might be at the beginning, it might be at the end, but you're probably going to have sales as a part of that funnel, and that's okay. So you're going to want to A/B test what sales talks about, like what messaging they use. When they reach out via email, what's the subject line of that email? What does that email say? How many times a week should they reach out? All of those types of things get tested. You're going to still test different landing pages that those emails send people to, things like that. But there's very similar funnels. It's just usually it ends up converting at the end with a person instead of like a form on a website. That's the major difference. And the lead cycles are longer, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can dismay, because there's a lot more steps in between the lead cycle that you can track. So the very best enterprise sales teams, or even mid-market B2B companies, they have very trackable funnels, and they're running lots of experiments. So I know the Slack growth team pretty well, and they're structured very similar to the Pinterest growth team in terms of how they operate. But talk to some larger enterprise sales companies, and you'll just find that a lot of these experiments are like, tracked inside Salesforce instead of, me writing a SQL query or running like an A/B experiment inside the product.
What's up, Casey?
Hey.
So one of the lines that stood out most to me from your talk was when you said you guys figured out that at GrubHub, when people saw more restaurants than they expected, that's when they started purchasing more. So
yep.
It's interesting that you didn't say a number, because it depends per city, I guess.
Yes.
So to me, that talks about customer development, which maybe you didn't go as much into in the talk, but maybe you can speak about how you did it at GrubHub. I'm guessing there was more at GrubHub than Pinterest, but if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, actually a lot at both companies. So the question is about customer development, and I think usually what's good talked about customer development is when you're starting a product, right? Trying to understand who your customer is and what they want. But that process doesn't ever really end, right? So for everything you're doing, you can obviously at scale, like at Pinterest, run a lot of A/B experiments to be like, oh, okay, people are clicking the button, awesome. But you still need to go back to users to understand like what they expected, did they get what they expected, and validate a lot of your assumptions. So I spent most of 2015 actually going around the world watching people use the Pinterest product, because we were trying to grow internationally. It wasn't going super well, and we were like, what the heck is going on? So then we did an experiment where we reduced Pinterest, we reduced sign up with Facebook, and instead pushed sign up with email, and our conversion rate increases. And then we run that in other countries, and our conversion rate increased the same amount. So we're like, we learned this valuable piece of customer feedback, and then we see if it works in other languages. So I think we at times at Pinterest got away from it, but then when we got back to it and started doing it regularly, that's when we were able to find a lot of our biggest wins. International growth is going amazing for Pinterest now. I think over 60% of users are from outside the US now. But it was something where it was clearly a different user from the user that we understood pretty well, and we had to go get out there and talk to them and watch them use the product and fail to understand what we needed to change. And then eventually we did a good job of that. But still, like, there are probably people right now at Pinterest that are in some other country watching people use the product. Like, it's not something you ever stop doing.
Great presentation. Pinterest had an interesting problem where there was a lot more women that used it than men.
Yep.
Something that Twitter and Facebook didn't really face. So I'm curious, what did the growth team do to increase the male user base? And also, did you target other subset of the markets? And if you did, like age or gender, and and how did you do that?
So when you have a distribution strategy like SEO, you actually give up your ability to target because you're going to rank for what you're going to rank for, and you're at the kind of reliance of whoever searches for those terms. So we couldn't say like, oh, we only want 25 to 35 women in US, right? Because like if they're searching for DIY stuff, but also 70-year-old women are searching for DIY stuff and men are searching for DIY stuff, we're going to show up every time. Like Google's not going to decide not to show us. But some of the things we did to try to address some of our shortcomings with men is the big issue with men was, I think it's no secret that Pinterest first blew up with Midwestern moms. And then they started, they started telling their husbands to get on. And then what did Pinterest ask you to do? Pinterest said, follow your Facebook friends. You click follow your Facebook friends, of whom it's mostly Midwestern women, and you see what Midwestern women are pinning. And they were pinning things about their wedding, about, recipes that you're not really interested in as a guy. And you would say, like, this site's for chicks. And then you would bail. So what we did is we rebuilt the onboarding flow where instead of asking you to follow your friends, we asked you what topics you cared about. So then you could pick, the things that you're interested in, men's fashion, et cetera, and then you would get the best content on those topics. And when we did that, men started to activate a lot better, but we did it way too late. So the stigma had already been created that Pinterest was for women.